Us. He gave them 9 months of honest work. They gave him public humiliation and a torn contract. What Victoria Hale never considered, what nobody inside that gleaming hangar ever stopped to ask, was why a man like Ethan Brooks said absolutely nothing when she ripped his invoice in half and told him to sue her. Quiet men are dangerous not because they threaten you. They're dangerous because they've already decided. And Ethan Brooks had decided 3 weeks ago, the morning he found the first falsified maintenance log tucked behind a panel on a Gulfstream that was supposed to carry 14 passengers into the sky. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The hangar at Meridian Executive Airport smelled the way it always did in the early hours. Jet fuel and metal and something faintly chemical. The residue of cleaning solvents that never fully dried before the next aircraft rolled in. Ethan Brooks noticed smells the way other people noticed weather. It told him things. Tonight the hangar smelled slightly wrong, a sharpness underneath the usual odors that he'd been clocking for the better part of a week without being able to name it exactly. He filed it away and kept moving. It was 7:15 in the evening when he finished the last of his inspection notes on the Challenger 3. 5-0, that had been sitting in Bay 4 since Tuesday. He capped his pen, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and walked the length of the aircraft one more time out of habit, running 2 fingers along a seam near the left elevator hinge that he'd already checked twice and didn't entirely trust. The hinge was fine. The seam was fine. He was being obsessive, and he knew it, but obsessive had kept him employed for 11 years without a single incident on any aircraft he'd signed off on, so he kept doing it. Skyvista Aviation had brought him on as an independent contractor 8 months earlier, which in practice meant he did the work of a senior line technician without the title, the benefits, or the job security. He'd known that going in. The rate was fair, or it had seemed fair at the time, and the work was consistent, and after a stretch of irregular contracts following the closure of his previous employer, consistent work was what he needed most. What he hadn't anticipated was the pace. Skyvista operated a fleet of high-end private jets and served a clientele that expected the impossible. Aircraft that were perpetually available, perpetually pristine, and perpetually on schedule. Victoria Hale, who had founded the company 6 years earlier and run it with the focused energy of someone who had grown up being told she couldn't, had built the Skyvista brand on exactly that promise. Her clients were executives and celebrities and the occasional foreign dignitary. They paid for the experience of never being made to wait, never being told a plane wasn't ready, never being handed a delay that made them feel ordinary. Ethan understood the pressure. He didn't resent it. What he resented, what had started as a low-level irritation and grown steadily into something more serious, was the way that pressure had begun shaping maintenance decisions. He'd first noticed it with a Phenom 300 back in early October. A crew had flagged a hydraulic pressure irregularity during a pre-flight check. The aircraft was booked for a 6 a.m. departure. The irregularity wasn't catastrophic. It was the kind of thing that warranted a proper diagnostic before signing off. Maybe 2 hours of work, maybe 3. The client was a hedge fund manager flying to a board meeting. Ryan Mercer, Skyvista's operations director, had come down to the hangar personally at 5:30 in the morning, looked at the flag, and told the senior tech on shift to note it as resolved and release the aircraft. The tech, a veteran named Okonkwo, who'd been with Skyvista since the beginning, had hesitated. Ethan had been nearby, refilling his coffee, and he'd watched Okonkwo's face cycle through something complicated before the man nodded and picked up his pen. The aircraft departed at 6:07. The flight was fine, nothing happened, but Ethan had written it down. He kept a personal log. It wasn't required. His contractual obligations were straightforward. Inspect assigned aircraft, document findings, sign off on completed work. He had no formal authority to ground a plane. That rested with the certifying technicians, and ultimately with operations management. What he had was his own notebook, a narrow black hardcover he kept in the chest pocket of his work jacket, and in it he recorded things that bothered him. Dates, tail numbers, the nature of the discrepancy, the name of whoever made the call to proceed. By the time November arrived, the notebook was half full. He didn't do anything with it right away. He told himself he was still gathering information, still making sure he understood what he was seeing before he drew conclusions. This was partly true. It was also partly the slower truth, that he was a contractor, not an employee, and that raising formal concerns through a company's own reporting structure, when you had no institutional standing, was a fast way to end a contract and acquire a reputation that followed you to the next job. He'd seen it happen to others. He knew how the story ended. So he kept his head down and kept his notebook and kept watching, and what he saw across November and into December was a pattern that had a momentum to it, the kind of momentum that comes not from individual decisions, but from a culture, from dozens of small choices made by dozens of different people, all of them responding to the same unspoken pressure, all of them telling themselves that the next flight would be fine, that nothing had gone wrong yet, that the risk was manageable. The falsified records he found by accident. He'd been assigned to do a routine inspection on a Gulfstream G550, tail number N441SV, that had just come back from a third-party avionics update. The aircraft's maintenance folder was waiting for him on the work table in the office annex off Bay 2, and when he opened it to cross-reference the avionics work against the aircraft's existing log, something didn't match. It was a small thing. A lubrication service recorded as completed on the 14th of November, signed off by a technician whose initials appeared in the log as DR. Ethan knew most of the Skyvista maintenance staff by this point, and DR corresponded to a man named Danny Rourke, who worked the overnight rotation. The service interval and the procedure notation were standard enough. What bothered Ethan was that he'd been in the hangar on November 14th, which was a Thursday, and he had a specific memory of Danny Rourke calling in sick that day because there'd been a brief scramble to cover his inspection duties, and Ethan had helped absorb 2 of them. He stood at the work table for a long moment, looking at the date and the initials. Then he went to his locker, retrieved the notebook, and checked his own entry for November 14th. Danny Rourke absent, shift coverage reassigned. Bay 3 inspection divided between Brooks and Malhotra. He photographed the page in the maintenance folder. Then he went and found 2 other aircraft folders and started cross-referencing, slowly and methodically, the way he approached any diagnostic task. By the time he was finished, nearly 90 minutes later, he had identified 5 separate entries across 3 different aircraft logs that corresponded to dates on which the signing technician either hadn't been working or had been assigned elsewhere. He drove home that night with his hands steady on the wheel and his mind doing something he'd trained himself not to let it do, running forward, imagining specific outcomes. An aircraft carrying 14 passengers, a hydraulic system with a logged repair that was never actually performed, a pilot who trusted the paperwork because the paperwork was supposed to be trustworthy. He slept badly. In the morning, he went back and found more. Welcome. The confrontation, if you could call it that, because only one side was actually confronting, happened on a Thursday in the second week of December, 3 days before Christmas. Ethan had submitted his final invoice for the contract period at the beginning of the week. The total was just under $41,000, representing 9 months of work at the agreed rate, minus the partial advance he'd received in April. He'd submitted it through the standard accounts process, attached his timesheets and work orders, and waited. On Thursday morning, the office manager, a nervous young woman named Priya, who clearly hated being the person in the middle of things, caught him near the coffee station and told him, with visible discomfort, that Victoria wanted to speak with him. He found her in the main hangar, not in her office. He realized later that this had probably been deliberate, that she'd chosen the floor for the visibility it provided, the audience it guaranteed. There were 7 or 8 technicians working nearby, plus 2 ground crew from the morning shift and a man in a blazer he didn't recognize who was standing off to the side with a phone in his hand. Victoria Hale was 43 years old and had the energy of someone who ran on conviction and strong coffee and not quite enough sleep. She was dressed for client meetings, a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, hair pulled back in a way that was tidy but not studied. She looked, as she almost always did, like she was already running slightly late for the next thing on her schedule. She had his invoice in her hand. "Mr. Brooks." She said his name the way people say the name of someone they've already made a decision about. Not hostile, exactly. Dismissive. "I've had a chance to review what you've submitted." "Okay," he said. "There are discrepancies." He waited. He'd learned a long time ago that silence was one of the most useful tools a person could carry into a difficult conversation. Several of your logged hours don't align with work orders that can be verified through our system, she said. We've also had concerns, ongoing concerns, about the quality and pace of your work. Frankly, some of what you've invoiced here reflects time we're not prepared to pay for. He looked at her steadily. Which hours specifically? Our accounting team can provide a breakdown. I'd like to see it now if possible. I've got my own records. Something moved behind her eyes. Not anger exactly, but the recognition that he wasn't going to make this easy. She'd been expecting, he guessed, someone who would absorb the reduction quietly, maybe push back a little, ultimately accept a fraction of what he was owed because a fraction was better than a legal dispute. What I'm prepared to offer, she said, is payment for 60% of your invoice total. That reflects what we can reasonably verify. That's not what the contract says. The contract also specifies performance standards that Victoria. He said her first name quietly, not to be familiar, but because he wanted her to hear that he was not rattled. I have 9 months of timesheets. I have the work orders. I have sign-off documentation on every aircraft I touched. I'm happy to sit down with your accounting team and go through it line by line. She looked at him for a moment, then she turned slightly, glancing toward the man in the blazer. Just a flicker of eye contact, something passing between them that Ethan couldn't fully read. Then she looked back at him, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, dropped a half register, acquired an edge. I think what might actually be helpful, she said, is if we talked about some of the concerns you've been raising internally, the questions you've been asking, some of the people you've been talking to. There it was. He'd wondered how long it would take to surface. I haven't been raising concerns internally, he said. I've been doing my job. You've been creating an atmosphere of doubt among my maintenance staff. I've had technicians come to me with questions about procedures, questions that, frankly, came from conversations with you. If your technicians have questions about procedures, that's worth paying attention to. What it is, she said, and now there was heat in it, controlled but genuine, is a contractor who has been here 9 months and thinks he understands how a company he doesn't own operates. What it is a pattern of behavior that has been disruptive to my team and my operations. She paused. Your contract is terminated, effective today. We'll process a final payment reflecting what we can reasonably verify. The hangar had gotten very quiet. Ethan was aware of people not making noise nearby. The particular quality of stillness that happens when a room full of people is listening hard while pretending not to. I'll need that in writing, he said. You'll receive a letter. And my invoice? She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not softened, but clarified. She made a deliberate decision about something. Then she took his invoice, the paper copy she'd been holding, and tore it once, a clean rip across the middle, and let the two halves drop to the concrete floor of the hangar. The sound it made was surprisingly loud in the quiet. Sue me, she said. Not angry, not theatrical, just 2 words, flat and final, with the faint smile of someone who was very certain about something. Then she turned and walked back toward the office corridor, and the man in the blazer followed her, and gradually the sound of work resumed around the hangar. Someone's tool hitting a surface, a compressor cycling on, someone coughing. And Ethan Brooks stood where he was for a few seconds, looking at the 2 pieces of his invoice on the floor. He bent down and picked them up. Both halves. Folded them once and put them in his pocket. Then he collected his toolbox from his locker, signed out of the facility, walked to his truck in the parking lot, and sat behind the wheel in the cold for about 4 minutes without starting the engine. He wasn't angry. He'd half expected something like this. Had felt it building for weeks, the way you can feel a weather change before you can see it. What he felt was something closer to a door closing, and on the other side of that door was the awareness that he was no longer constrained by the question of whether to say something. He'd been careful. He'd been patient. He'd given them every reasonable opportunity to be better than they were. He started the truck, pulled out of the lot, and drove home through the gray December afternoon. And in his mind, he was already sorting. Photographs, dates, tail numbers, initials that didn't match the rosters, a hydraulic irregularity signed off by a man who'd been standing right in front of Ryan Mercer when he gave the order to release the aircraft. He had everything. He'd had everything for weeks. The only question now was who to call first. He spent the first night doing nothing. That wasn't avoidance, it was discipline. Ethan had learned years ago that the worst decisions he'd ever made had come from moving too fast on something that felt urgent. Urgency was a feeling, not a fact, and feelings had a way of narrowing your vision right at the moment when you most needed it wide open. So he made dinner, ate it standing at the kitchen counter because he'd never bothered buying a proper table for the apartment, and then he sat on the couch with the television off and let his mind do what it needed to do. The two torn halves of his invoice were on the kitchen counter beside the stove. He'd smoothed them out when he got home, lined up the edges carefully, as though it mattered. Maybe it did. He hadn't decided yet. What he kept coming back to wasn't the money, though $41,000 was not nothing, especially not after 9 months of 6-day weeks and the kind of physical work that left a man's hands sore and his lower back sending small complaints up his spine every time he sat down. The money was real, and the loss of it was real, and he was going to need to deal with that practically. But the money wasn't what kept him awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his bedroom while the heat kicked on and off in the walls. What kept him awake was the Gulfstream. N441SV was scheduled for a departure at 8 o'clock Saturday morning. He knew the booking because he'd seen the flight manifest on the operations board that morning before the confrontation. 14 passengers, according to the pre-flight sheet, a corporate retreat group, somebody's executive team flying to a private resort 3 states over. He didn't know their names. He didn't need to. The number was enough. 14 people sitting in leather seats at 38,000 feet, trusting that the aircraft carrying them there was what the paperwork said it was. The paperwork was not what it said it was. He knew that with the kind of certainty that doesn't require argument. He got up at 2 in the morning and went to his desk. Ethan had always been methodical about documentation in a way that some people mistook for timidity, as though the care he took was the behavior of someone afraid to commit, someone who needed the protection of a paper trail because he lacked the nerve to act without one. That wasn't it. The documentation was how he thought. It was how he converted the raw anxiety of suspicion into something he could actually use. He opened his laptop and started building a file. He had photographs, taken on his personal phone during late shifts when the hangar was quiet, of maintenance log pages he'd been permitted access to as part of his inspection work. He had his own notebook with entries going back to October, cross-referencing dates and tail numbers against discrepancies he'd observed. He had the timesheets of half a dozen technicians that he'd unofficially memorized because he had the kind of memory that held schedules and dates the way other people held song lyrics, without trying and without being able to turn it off. He also had something he hadn't fully processed yet. A conversation he'd overheard 6 weeks earlier between Ryan Mercer and a senior technician named Gil Frazier. Ethan had been working late in Bay 3 when the two men came in thinking the area was empty. What he heard, fragments, not a complete picture but enough, was Mercer telling Frazier that the records needed to reflect completion regardless of whether the work had actually been finished, because the investors were doing a facility tour on Friday and the fleet condition reports needed to look clean. Frazier had pushed back, not hard but genuinely, saying something about liability, about his license. Mercer had said, "Your license is fine. I need the paperwork done by Thursday." Ethan had written it down that same night, time, location, as much of the verbatim exchange as he could reconstruct. He hadn't recorded it. He hadn't anticipated needing to, and anyway, recording a private conversation without consent carried its own legal complications. But he had the written account, and he had the date, and he was fairly confident that if Gil Frazier was ever asked about that conversation under circumstances where honesty served him better than loyalty, the man would not deny it. By 4 in the morning, he had a folder on his laptop containing 47 photographs, his typed-up notebook entries covering 11 weeks of observations, and a 6-page summary document he'd written in plain language describing what he believed he'd found, how he'd found it, and what the practical risk to passengers appeared to be. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an investigator. He wrote it the way he'd write a technical report, factual, specific, without interpretation beyond what the evidence directly supported. He also wrote down the flight number and departure time for Saturday's Gulfstream. Then he looked up the number for the FAA's Aviation Safety Hotline, which he'd actually looked up 2 weeks earlier and written on a Post-it note that he'd stuck to the inside cover of his notebook. He told himself at the time it was just good to have. Now he sat looking at it and understood that having it had never really been a precaution. It had been a preparation. He slept 3 hours. In the morning, he made coffee, drank it black, and called the number at 7:45. The person who answered was calm and professional and took his information without audible reaction, which was either reassuring or unsettling depending on how you thought about these things. Ethan gave his name, his contact number, his former employer's name and address, and a concise summary of what he'd documented. He was told that a case would be opened and that someone from the regional field office would be in contact, likely within 24 to 48 hours, to discuss the evidence he'd referenced. "The aircraft," he said. "N441SV. It's scheduled to depart Saturday at 8 a.m. He looked at the clock. "That's about 26 hours from now." There was a brief pause. "I'm noting the urgency. Can you provide the departure airport?" "Meridian Executive. The full facility address is—" "I have it. Thank you, Mr. Brooks. I want to emphasize that I can't make promises about timeline, but I've flagged this as time-sensitive." He gave his email address and said he'd send the full documentation package within the hour. After he hung up, he sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. He'd expected to feel something more definitive: relief or apprehension, or the particular hollow sensation that follows a decision you can't walk back. What he felt instead was tired and a little hungry and slightly cold because the apartment's heating was unpredictable in December. He made toast and sent the email. What happened next was the part nobody tells you about, the part between making the right decision and seeing whether it produces any consequences. The waiting. He'd submitted everything he had to people he'd never met, in a process he had no control over, regarding a situation that was no longer technically his professional concern. He was a terminated contractor. He had no access to the facility. He had no standing inside the company. He was a man sitting in a cold apartment in December with a plate of toast and an email receipt in his inbox, and for the next several hours there was genuinely nothing more he could do. He called his friend Marcus around noon. Marcus was a former aircraft mechanic who'd left the industry 4 years earlier to run a small auto repair shop, and he was one of the few people Ethan talked to about work in any substantive way. He didn't explain everything. He gave Marcus the shape of it, the broad outline. "So you turned them in," Marcus said. "I reported a safety concern to the appropriate federal authority." "Yeah." "You turned them in." Marcus's voice had a familiar flatness that meant he was thinking. "And they owe you 40 grand. That's a separate issue." "Everything's a separate issue until it isn't. You understand how this looks, right? Guy gets fired, same day he calls the FAA. I know how it looks. What are you going to do about the money?" "I'll pursue it. Small claims won't cover the full amount, so I'll need to look at my options." "But I'm not doing this for the money, Marcus." "I know you're not," Marcus said, and he said it without skepticism, which Ethan appreciated. "That's actually what worries me a little. The people who are going to be looking at this situation are going to assume you are." "Let them assume. The evidence is what it is." There was a pause on the line. "How solid is it?" "Very. Like court solid? Like this isn't going to fall apart when lawyers start picking at it solid?" Ethan thought about his folder. The photographs, the dated notebook entries, the summary document, the specificity of dates against the roster records that he'd cross-referenced. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said finally. "Let me know what happens." That was Marcus. Never overly dramatic, never falsely reassuring, but dependably present in the way that mattered. The kind of person who said, "Let me know," and actually meant it. The afternoon passed slowly. Ethan reorganized his documentation twice, not because it needed reorganization, but because it was something to do with his hands. He went for a walk in the cold air around his neighborhood, past the convenience store and the dry cleaner, and the small park where 2 kids were doing something on bicycles that looked dangerous, and probably was. He came back and checked his email. Nothing yet. What he hadn't anticipated, what became clear to him over the course of that long Friday, was how much heavier the thing felt now that it was in motion. While he'd been gathering evidence, While he'd been carefully, quietly building a record inside the facility, there had been a task to focus on. The task had given the situation a structure. Now the task was done, and what was left was the rawness of what the task had actually been about. He'd worked with some of those technicians for 8 months. Okonkwo, who'd hesitated over the hydraulic irregularity, and then signed off anyway. Ethan genuinely liked the man. Okonkwo was good at his job, meticulous in most of the ways that mattered, and had a dry humor that made long shifts more bearable. Gil Frazier was a 15-year industry veteran who'd probably told himself 100 times that what he was doing was a minor shortcut, a bureaucratic adjustment, not a real safety issue. These were not cartoon villains. They were people who'd been slowly shaped by a system that rewarded compliance and penalized friction, people who'd convinced themselves incrementally that the line they were crossing was smaller than it was. That didn't make what they'd done acceptable. Ethan was clear on that. But it made it human, and the human part of it sat in his chest differently than anger would have. Ryan Mercer was something else. Ethan had watched Mercer closely over 9 months and had formed a specific opinion of him. Mercer was the kind of man who understood exactly what he was doing and had long ago decided that the calculus worked in his favor. Not reckless, calculating. He managed upward with precision, keeping Victoria Hale insulated from the granular realities of maintenance operations while translating her pressure for performance into directives that pushed down onto the technical staff. He was the mechanism that converted institutional ambition into falsified paperwork, and he was smart enough to have kept his own hands, technically, clean. He'd never signed a maintenance record himself. He just stood over the people who did and told them what to write. Ethan thought about Mercer on Friday afternoon, sitting at his desk with the last of the daylight going gray outside the window. He thought about the particular kind of intelligence that goes into that sort of arrangement, the operational intelligence of a man who knows exactly how accountability works and has positioned himself accordingly. It was, he had to acknowledge, sophisticated. It was also the kind of sophistication that had a way of unraveling very specifically when the people it depended on were no longer protected by silence. At 6:17 in the evening, his phone rang. The number was a Virginia area code he didn't recognize. Mr. Brooks, this is Investigator Dana Yee from the FAA's Flight Standards District Office. I've reviewed the materials you submitted this morning, and I have some questions. Her voice was measured, efficient, the voice of someone who'd made a lot of calls like this and had learned to front-load the credibility signals to move past the part where people decided whether to take her seriously. Of course, he said. I want to start by saying your documentation is detailed, and we take this kind of report very seriously. I also want to be transparent with you. I need to understand the circumstances under which you came to have access to these maintenance records, and I need to understand the timeline of your employment and termination. I expected that, he said. There was a slight pause. Good. Then let's start from the beginning. He talked for 40 minutes. He was careful and factual, and when he didn't know something precisely, he said so instead of estimating. He told her how he'd accessed the records, legitimately, as part of his assigned inspection work, and he told her the specific dates he'd photographed them and the reason he'd done it. He told her about the Phenom 300 in October, about the conversation between Mercer and Frazier, about the 5 log entries he'd identified with mismatched signatures against roster records. The N441SB, he said at one point, the Saturday departure. I've noted that aircraft specifically, she said. I can't tell you what actions we'll take or when, but I want you to know it's been flagged at the appropriate level. Okay, he said. That's all I needed to hear. When the call ended, he stood in his kitchen for a moment, then opened the refrigerator, stared into it without purpose, and closed it again. He thought about the 14 names on Saturday's flight manifest, still nameless to him, still just a number. And he thought about the fact that they would almost certainly never know his name, never know that anything had almost gone wrong, never know there had been a man with a notebook and a phone full of photographs who'd spent 9 months paying attention to details that no one had asked him to pay attention to. That was fine. That had never been the point. He opened the refrigerator again, found the leftover pasta he'd made Tuesday, and put it in the microwave. While it heated, he pulled out his phone and looked at the screen for a moment, then put it face down on the counter. The next few hours were Victoria Hale's problem, and Ryan Mercer's problem, and the FAA's problem. What they did with the information he'd handed them was not something he could control, and he'd made his peace with that, or was working on it anyway, which was close enough for a Friday night in December. He ate his pasta standing at the counter. The apartment was quiet. Outside, he could hear the occasional sound of cars passing on the street below. And once, somewhere in the distance, the low metallic sound of an aircraft descending toward an approach path. The sound he'd grown up hearing as a kid near the regional airport in the town where he was born. The sound that had made him decide what he wanted to do with his life before he was old enough to articulate why. He washed his bowl. He went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well, but he slept. The call came at 5:41 in the morning. Ethan was already awake, had been awake since around 4:30, lying in the dark with the particular alertness of someone whose body understood that sleep was finished, even if his mind hadn't fully accepted it yet. He'd been listening to the apartment building's heating system make its irregular ticking sounds and thinking, without wanting to, about Saturday's 8 o'clock departure. His phone screen lit up the ceiling, the same Virginia area code. "Mr. Brooks?" It was Investigator Yee, and her voice had a different quality than it had the previous evening. Tighter, more compressed, the sound of someone who hadn't slept much either. "I wanted to let you know that a team will be arriving at Meridian Executive this morning. I can't give you details about the operation, but I wanted you to be aware." "Okay," he said. He was sitting up now, feet on the cold floor. "I also want to prepare you for the possibility that this is going to become a significant situation. What you submitted, the breadth of it. This isn't going to be a quiet administrative review." He thought about what to say to that and settled on, "I understand. Are you represented by counsel?" "Not yet." "You should be." She said it plainly, not as a warning exactly, but as practical advice from someone who knew how these things unfolded. Not because you've done anything wrong. Because when something like this moves, it moves fast, and you want somebody in your corner who knows the terrain. After she hung up, he sat on the edge of the bed for a full minute. Then he got dressed, made coffee, and stood at his kitchen window watching the street below slowly accumulate the gray early light of a December Saturday. He didn't go to the facility. He had no right to be there. And more practically, showing up at the scene of a federal inspection he'd triggered would have been the kind of move that muddied things unnecessarily. What he did instead was call Marcus at 6:15. Marcus answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. "Something's happening," Ethan said. "I figured," Marcus said. "You wouldn't call at 6 in the morning otherwise. Talk to me." Ethan told him what Yee had said, the condensed version, just the shape of it. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Ethan valued about him. "You need a lawyer," Marcus said when he finished. "That's what she said." "She's right. I know a guy. Not aviation, but he does employment and whistleblower work, and he'll know who to call if it gets specialized. Let me text you his number." "It's 6 in the morning, Marcus." "I'll text you his number," Marcus repeated, as though Ethan hadn't spoken, "and you call him when it's a reasonable hour, which is soon, because neither of us is going back to sleep." At Meridian Executive Airport, the morning shift had started the way it always started. The overnight technicians finishing their logs, the day crew filtering in through the side entrance with coffees, and the slightly dazed expressions of people whose bodies had not yet fully committed to being conscious. The operations board showed 4 scheduled departures, the earliest of which was the Gulfstream N441SV at 8 o'clock, and the duty manager, a man named Peterson, who'd been with Sky Vista 4 years, was doing his standard morning walkthrough of the hangar. He was on his second lap when the vehicles arrived. 3 of them, 2 unmarked sedans and a white SUV with federal plates, pulled into the facility's main access road at 6:52. The individuals who got out were wearing identification credentials and carrying equipment cases, and they moved with the particular purposeful unhurriedness of people who had done this kind of thing before and knew that speed mattered less than precision. Peterson met them at the hangar entrance. Later, he would describe the experience as feeling like the floor of a building you've walked across 1,000 times, suddenly revealing that it had been glass all along. The lead inspector, a lean man in his 50s named Hargrove, who wore his credentials clipped to his jacket breast pocket, introduced himself and presented the inspection authority documentation. "We'll need your full maintenance records for the current fleet," he said, "and we'll need the aircraft scheduled for your 8 o'clock departure grounded pending inspection." Peterson said, "I'll need to call my operations director." "You can make that call," Hargrove said. "We'll be proceeding while you do." Ryan Mercer's phone rang at 6:58. He was at home, already dressed. He was always dressed early on days with morning departures, a professional habit he'd maintained for 12 years. And when he saw it was Peterson calling rather than the main operations line, he felt something cold move through him before he answered. Peterson told him what was happening in the clipped, slightly strangled voice of a man trying to stay professional while delivering information that was detonating as he spoke it. FAA, Federal Inspection. The Gulfstream grounded. Records requested. Mercer said, "Don't touch anything. Don't move anything. I'm coming in." He stood in his kitchen for approximately 30 seconds after ending the call. He was a precise thinker. This was something he'd always prided himself on, the ability to analyze a situation rapidly and identify his best available position. 30 seconds was enough time to understand, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years calculating exposure, that this was not a routine inspection. Routine inspections were scheduled. Routine inspections didn't arrive before 7 in the morning on a Saturday with 3 vehicles and a grounding order. Someone had talked. The pool of people who knew enough to make this happen was small, and as he ran through it, quickly, methodically, the way he did everything, he arrived at the same name the logic kept returning to. He made one phone call before he left his house, not to Victoria, to a man who handled certain administrative matters for the company, legal-adjacent work that Mercer had been paying for out of a discretionary operations budget in a way that he had been careful to make difficult to trace. He told the man to get to the office before he did, and to start with the physical files in the secondary records cabinet in maintenance admin. Then he got in his car and drove. He arrived at the facility at 7:23. By then, inspectors had already spread through the hangar in pairs, working methodically through the maintenance bays, and a third team had taken over the records room off the operations corridor. Peterson met him at the entrance, visibly shaken, and told him in a low voice that they'd already pulled the logs for 5 aircraft and had been in the records room for 20 minutes. Mercer walked to the records room. One of the inspectors, a woman with short hair and a tablet in her hand, looked up when he entered and said, "Sir, this area is restricted during the inspection. I need you to step back into the hallway." "I'm the operations director," he said. "This is my department." "I understand that. You're still going to need to wait in the hallway." The secondary records cabinet, the one he'd called about, was open. It was open and it was empty, and for one brief, vertiginous moment, Mercer thought the man had gotten there first, had done what he'd been asked. Then he looked more carefully and saw the numbered evidence tags on the cabinet shelves. Not empty. Cleared. By the inspectors. Before the man he'd called had arrived, he felt the floor shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with physics. Victoria Hale arrived at the facility at 7:51. She hadn't been called by Peterson. She'd been called by one of the investors, a man named Gareth Lund, who'd received an alert through a news aggregator service he subscribed to. The alert was small, just a brief item on an aviation industry news feed. FAA. Conducting unannounced inspection at Meridian Executive Facility, Skyvista Aviation Operations temporarily halted. 16 words. She read them in her car in her driveway and sat very still for a moment before starting the engine. She'd built Skyvista from a leased desk in a shared office space and 2 aircraft. She'd talked a regional bank into financing on the strength of a business plan and what her first investor had called an unreasonable amount of confidence. 6 years. She had 12 aircraft now, 43 employees, and a client list that included the kind of names that opened other doors just by being mentioned. She had a brand. She had a reputation. She drove to the facility thinking about reputation. When she walked into the hangar, the first thing she registered was how different it felt. Not visually. The aircraft were where they always were. The bays looked the same, but the atmosphere was wrong, compressed somehow, like the air pressure before a storm. Her people were standing around in small clusters, not working, watching the federal inspectors move through the space with their clipboards and their equipment cases and their unhurried authority. Hargrove introduced himself to her in the corridor outside operations. He was professionally courteous, the way a doctor is courteous when delivering a diagnosis they've delivered before. Not unkind, but not cushioning either. "We're conducting a comprehensive inspection of your maintenance records and fleet condition," he said. "Based on information received, we have credible indication of systemic documentation irregularities affecting multiple aircraft. All departures are suspended pending completion of our review." "What?" Victoria said very carefully. "How long will that take?" "It's difficult to say at this stage. At minimum, 48 hours. Potentially longer, depending on what we find." "Can you tell me the source of the information you received?" Hargrove looked at her with the neutral expression of someone who had been asked that question before. "We're not in a position to share that at this time." She already suspected. She'd suspected the moment she'd read the news alert, had felt a specific name form in the back of her mind with a specificity that was uncomfortable. She didn't say the name out loud. She went to her office instead, closed the door, and called her attorney. The attorney's name was Carlisle, and he'd handled SkyVista's legal matters since the company's second year. He listened without interruption while she explained the situation, and when she was finished, there was a brief silence. "Victoria, I need you to answer me honestly," he said. "What are they going to find?" She sat with the question. She'd been sitting with a version of it, she realized, for months, had been not quite asking it to herself in the way you don't quite look at something that's in your peripheral vision because you're not certain you want it to come into focus. "I don't know the full extent," she said. I knew there was pressure on the maintenance schedule. I knew things were moving fast, but I didn't know." She stopped. "I left the operational specifics to Ryan." Carlisle was quiet again for a moment. "All right," he said. "Don't speak to the investigators without me present. I'm going to make some calls and I'll be there within the hour." She hung up and looked at the surface of her desk, the clean, organized surface she kept because disorder made it hard for her to think, and thought about Ryan Mercer, who was somewhere in the building right now, and about the fact that she had genuinely, not dishonestly, believed that the pressure she applied was the reasonable pressure of a competitive business environment. She had genuinely believed that her people would find ways to meet the standards she set without compromising the standards that mattered most. This was the thing she would have to sit with for a long time, the question of whether she had genuinely believed it or had chosen to. In the hangar, Inspector Hargrove had pulled Okonkwo aside and was speaking with him quietly near Bay 3. Okonkwo was a big man with a careful face, and he stood with his arms at his sides listening to Hargrove with the stillness of someone who had decided something very recently and was now committed to it. "I need to ask you about the Phenom 300, Hargrove said. "October departure, the hydraulic flag." Okonkwo didn't look away. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know what happened." There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds. Then Okonkwo said, "Mercer told me to release it. I said the diagnostic wasn't complete. He told me to note it resolved and release the aircraft." Another pause. "I signed off on it." "Why?" The question sat in the air between them. Okonkwo looked at the floor for a moment and then back up. "Because I needed this job," he said. That's the honest answer. My wife was 7 months pregnant and we had a mortgage, and I told myself it was probably fine, the irregularity was probably minor, and that if I pushed back, I'd be done here. He stopped. I've thought about it most days since then. Hargrove wrote something on his clipboard. "I'm going to need a formal statement." "I know," Okonkwo said. "I'll give you one." Ryan Mercer found out about the digital records at 9:47 in the morning. He'd known about the physical files, had understood in those first minutes that whatever had been in the secondary cabinet was already in federal hands. What he hadn't fully accounted for was the backup system. SkyVista had migrated to a cloud-based maintenance management platform 18 months earlier, and the migration had included, as a data integrity measure, automated time-stamped backups of every entry, every modification, and every deletion across the system. The platform's architecture, which Mercer had been briefed on during implementation and had not paid sufficient attention to, retained a changelog. Every edit was preserved, every original entry, and its subsequent modification existed as a layered record. He learned this when Hargrove summoned him to the records room at 9:47, showed him a printout on the table, and said, "Can you explain this?" The printout showed a maintenance entry for the G550, tail number N441SV, and beside the original entry, in the changelog column, a different notation. The original, time-stamped, showed an incomplete inspection flag. The modified version, dated 9 days later, showed the flag cleared and a completion notation added. The name on both entries was the same technician. The modification had been made at 11:14 on a Friday night. Mercer looked at the printout. He was good at reading situations, had spent 12 years being good at it. And what he read in this moment was the specific quality of evidence that doesn't leave room for alternative explanations. Not because there weren't other possible explanations, because Hargrove was showing him this particular printout in this particular way, which meant there were more of them. And the man across the table from him knew it. "I'd like to have my attorney present before continuing this conversation," Mercer said. "That's your right," Hargrove said. Mercer walked out of the records room and down the corridor to the fire exit, pushed through the door and stood in the cold outside air. His phone was in his hand. He called his attorney. Then he called his wife and told her, in a voice he worked very hard to keep even, that she should expect the next few weeks to be complicated. By 10:30 that morning, the story had moved beyond the aviation industry feed. A regional news outlet picked it up, then a national wire service. The coverage was thin and initial. Federal inspection, operations suspended, no official comment from the FAA or from Sky Vista, but it was enough to produce a cascade of calls to Victoria Hale's phone from clients, from investors, from the company's PR firm, all arriving within a 90-minute window in a kind of overlapping wave that she handled from her office with her door closed and her attorney now seated across from her desk. Gareth Lund, the investor who'd sent her the original alert, called at 11:15. He didn't ask what was happening. He said, "Victoria, I'm going to need you to tell me that this is containable." She looked at Carlyle, who gave her a small, specific shake of his head. "Gareth," she said, "I think we need to have a broader conversation before I can tell you anything definitively." There was a silence on the line that communicated several things at once. "All right," he said, "I'll be there this afternoon." She set the phone down and looked at Carlyle. "How bad is this?" she asked, not in the voice she used for clients or investors, but in a quieter register. He didn't soften it. "Depends on what they find. If it's isolated to documentation irregularities, it's serious but potentially manageable. If the physical aircraft inspections turn up actual structural or mechanical deficiencies that weren't addressed, it escalates significantly. In the worst-case scenario, you're looking at potential criminal exposure for the individuals who directed the falsification." "Ryan." "Almost certainly. Possibly others." He paused. "Victoria, I need to ask you something directly. Were you ever made aware specifically of maintenance discrepancies being logged as resolved before the work was completed?" She thought about the question carefully, not because she was calculating, she was tired of calculating, but because she wanted to answer it accurately. "Not specifically," she said. "I was aware that Ryan managed the maintenance operation aggressively. I was aware that we had a culture of prioritizing schedule. I pushed for that culture." She stopped. "I told myself the specific operational decisions were his domain." Carlyle nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "That's where we start." Outside in the hangar, the inspectors worked through the morning with the systematic thoroughness of people who had a clear picture of what they were looking for and were finding it. Aircraft panels were opened. Systems were accessed. Physical condition was compared against logged maintenance records. And in several cases, the comparison produced findings that Hargrove documented with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to react visibly to things he found in hangars, because reacting wasn't useful and neutrality was. By noon, 2 additional aircraft had been flagged for condition discrepancies. By 1 in the afternoon, the 8 o'clock Gulfstream, N441SV, still sitting in Bay 1 exactly where it had been since Thursday, had been examined by 2 separate inspection teams, and what they found in the left engine nacelle and in the forward avionics bay confirmed what Ethan's photographs had suggested. logged maintenance that had not been performed, and a condition that the aircraft's original flag notation had correctly identified and that someone had subsequently decided to sign away rather than repair. The 14 passengers who had been scheduled to board that aircraft at 8 o'clock that morning had been notified of a delay at 7:45, just before the facility suspension was made official. They didn't know why. They would learn, in the days that followed, approximately why, though the full picture would take longer to emerge. What they had on this particular Saturday was an inconvenience, rescheduled plans, alternative arrangements, the frustration of a disrupted morning. Not one of them would ever fully understand how close the inconvenience had been to something else entirely. Ethan found out about the grounding from Marcus, who'd been monitoring the news feed on his phone and called at 7:58, 2 minutes before the scheduled departure, to say, "They grounded it." Ethan was sitting in his apartment with his second cup of coffee, still in the clothes he'd slept in, and he said, "Okay. You all right?" He thought about it honestly. "Yeah," he said. "I think so. That's 14 people who don't know what almost happened to them today." "I know. And you're just sitting there drinking coffee." "I'm sitting here drinking coffee," Ethan confirmed. Marcus made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "All right," he said. "Call the lawyer." Ethan called the lawyer. The lawyer Marcus had recommended was a man named Philip Draper, and he turned out to be exactly the kind of attorney Ethan hadn't known he needed. Not polished in the way that made you feel like you were being managed, but sharp in a specific, practical way that expressed itself mostly through the quality of his questions. He was in his mid-50s, worked out of a modest office above a dry cleaning establishment on the east side of the city, and had spent 20 years doing employment and whistleblower cases before most of the larger firms had decided that space was worth paying attention to. He called Ethan back within 2 hours of the initial message. They met the following Monday morning, and within 40 minutes of sitting down together, Draper had read through Ethan's documentation summary, asked 14 pointed questions, and leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone doing arithmetic. "You documented this yourself," he said, "over 11 weeks. Yes?" "Without being asked to, without any formal whistleblower designation or internal compliance process." "There wasn't an internal process that would have done anything useful," Ethan said. Draper looked at him for a moment. "No, there wasn't," he agreed. "That's actually one of the things we're going to establish clearly." He tapped the documentation summary with 2 fingers. "The terminated contract and unpaid wages. That's straightforward. The question is whether we pursue it as a standalone wage claim or as part of a broader retaliation framework under federal whistleblower protections." "What's the difference practically?" "Damages," Draper said. "Wage claim gets you what they owe you, maybe attorney's fees. Retaliation claim, if we can demonstrate that your termination was connected to your safety reporting activity, and I think we can, given the timeline, gets you significantly more. The termination happened the same day you confronted them about the records, which was itself the same day they tore up your invoice." Ethan thought about the 2 halves of his invoice on the hangar floor. He'd kept both pieces. They were in a folder on his kitchen counter, flattened and taped back together. "The federal investigation complicates things," Draper continued, "but also helps us because it independently corroborates your documentation. Every finding they confirm is an asset in our case." He paused. "This is going to take time. I want you to understand that. These things don't resolve in weeks." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not in a hurry." Draper studied him for a moment with the mild curiosity of someone encountering an unfamiliar type. "Most people who come in here are in a hurry," he said. "Most people didn't spend 9 months being careful," Ethan said. Draper smiled briefly and picked up his pen. The investigation that Hargrove's team had initiated on Saturday morning expanded significantly over the following 10 days. What had begun as a targeted inspection of SkyVista's records and current fleet condition grew, as federal investigations in these circumstances often do, into a comprehensive audit of the company's maintenance practices across a 4-year window. The scope expanded not because the investigators were being aggressive, but because each layer they pulled back revealed another layer underneath, and each layer had its own set of discrepancies, its own falsified signatures, its own instances of work logged as complete before it was started, or instead of being started at all. 4 years. That was the timeline that emerged, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of evidence that added up to something neither Hargrove nor his team found particularly surprising, because they had seen versions of this pattern before. A company builds a culture under pressure. The culture develops shortcuts. The shortcuts become normalized. The normalization becomes invisible. Nobody inside the system can see it clearly anymore because they've been inside it long enough that what's abnormal has come to feel like the baseline. What was notable about Sky Vista was the consistency of it, how thoroughly the culture had penetrated every level of maintenance operations, and how effectively Ryan Mercer had functioned as the mechanism that kept it going while keeping the most explicit decisions off any paper trail that pointed directly at him. The digital record, however, did not share Mercer's appreciation for plausible deniability. The maintenance management platform's changelog, which the company's IT administrator had accessed with the investigators present, contained 4 years of layered data. Every modification, every deletion attempt, and there were several, some dated within the last 72 hours, which created its own category of legal exposure for Mercer, because attempting to destroy or alter records under federal investigation was not a footnote. It was a charge. Hargrove's team worked through the changelog with methodical patience over several days, and what they produced was a timeline, specific, documented, incontrovertible, of a maintenance operation that had been systematically falsified across dozens of records involving 9 different aircraft over 47 months. The physical inspections confirmed it. Systems logged as service that showed wear patterns inconsistent with recent maintenance, components logged as replaced that were original equipment, inspections logged as complete that, based on the physical condition of the aircraft, had either been performed incompletely or not at all. Of the 12 aircraft in SkyVista's current fleet, 7 were grounded pending remedial maintenance. 3 more were placed under restricted operational status. 2 were cleared. The 2 that were cleared were both aircraft that Ethan had personally inspected and signed off on, a detail that appeared in Hargrove's preliminary report as a factual notation and that Ethan himself didn't find out about until Draper told him weeks later. The press coverage, which had started thin and fragmented on Saturday morning, developed steadily across the following week into something with weight and reach. The initial wire service story was picked up by the major aviation trade publications, then by several national outlets covering it from a business and consumer safety angle. The framing shifted as more information emerged, from Federal Inspection Halt's luxury aviation company to something that carried a sharper edge, the kind of story that tended to generate the particular public attention that made institutional responses unavoidable. Gareth Lund had arrived at the facility on Saturday afternoon as promised, and his meeting with Victoria had lasted 2 hours. Ethan didn't know what was said in that room. Draper had some information from sources he didn't fully disclose, but the practical outcome became clear within the week. Lund and 2 other primary investors formally requested an emergency board review, and in the 72 hours following that request, 2 senior executives who reported to Victoria submitted resignations. The board review happened on the following Thursday. It lasted most of the day. Victoria attended with Carlisle beside her and gave an account of her understanding of SkyVista's maintenance operations that was, according to sources Draper would later reference, notably thorough in its acknowledgement of what she had not known and unusually direct about what she now understood the consequences of that not knowing had been. She did not blame Ryan Mercer for everything. This was observed by several people in the room, and it was observed specifically because it would have been easy and tactically sensible to position Mercer as the sole architect of the scheme and herself as a deceived executive operating in good faith. She had a genuine case for that narrative. The distance between her decisions and Mercer's operational execution was real, and Carlisle had advised her of the legal and reputational value of maintaining it clearly. Instead, she said this, in a room full of investors and board members who were already calculating their exits. The pressure that Ryan applied to my maintenance staff was the pressure that I applied to Ryan. I created an environment where schedule performance was the primary measure of operational success. I rewarded people who kept the aircraft moving, and I didn't ask enough questions about how they were doing it. Ryan made choices that I believe were criminal, and he'll answer for those. but the culture those choices grew in, that's mine. It wasn't a confession to legal wrongdoing. Carlyle had been precise about that. But it was something else, something less calculated. And several people in that room, people who had been in boardrooms long enough to have developed a precise sensitivity to the difference between managed messaging and something a person actually meant, registered it as such. The meeting ended without a clear resolution on Victoria's position. What was clear was that the company's operational future was uncertain and its immediate financial situation was deteriorating. 3 major clients had already suspended their contracts pending the investigation's outcome. A fourth was publicly consulting with legal counsel about potential exposure from having used an aircraft that federal inspectors had subsequently found to be in substandard condition. The lawsuit implications alone were enough to have produced, by Friday morning, a noticeable shift in the behavior of every financial institution that had any relationship with SkyVista. Ryan Mercer's attorney had, in the days following the inspection, attempted to construct a defense framework built on 2 pillars. First, that Mercer's directives to maintenance staff had been misinterpreted, and second, that the digital changelog entries most directly implicating him were the result of technicians acting on their own authority without his explicit knowledge. The second pillar collapsed almost immediately when Gil Frazier, who had retained his own attorney and was evaluating his cooperation options with the attention of a man who understood precisely what he was evaluating, provided investigators with a recorded account of the conversation Ethan had overheard in Bay 3 6 weeks earlier. Frazier's version was more complete than Ethan's written reconstruction because Frazier had been a direct participant in it. He provided the date, the content, and the specific language Mercer had used. "I need the paperwork done by Thursday," along with 4 other conversations spanning 18 months in which Mercer had directed maintenance staff to sign off on incomplete or unperformed work. He also provided something Ethan hadn't known about, a series of text messages from Mercer sent over a company-issued phone that constituted a separate documentary record of the directives that had driven the falsification pattern. Mercer's attorney had filed a motion challenging Frazier's credibility as a cooperative witness with his own legal exposure. The motion was technically sound and went nowhere useful because the text messages were not subject to credibility challenges. Okonkwo gave his formal statement on the Monday after the inspection. He sat across from a federal investigator for 3 hours and described, with the same unflinching honesty he'd shown Hargrove in the hangar, every instance he could recall of being directed to approve work that wasn't done, to release aircraft that hadn't been cleared, to prioritize departure schedules over the maintenance flags that departure schedules were supposed to wait for. He was specific about dates. He was specific about which directives had come from Mercer directly and which had come from the general cultural understanding that grounding an aircraft was a failure that would be remembered. When it was over, he sat in the parking lot of the federal building for a while before driving home. He called his wife and told her that he'd done what he should have done a long time ago. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Are you going to be all right?" And he said he thought so, which was honest, which was more than he'd managed to be for the better part of 2 years. Ethan followed the investigation's progress through Draper, and occasionally through investigator Yee, who called him twice more in the weeks following the initial inspection to clarify specific elements of his documentation and to confirm details that the investigation had independently verified. She was professionally careful about what she shared, but she was also straightforward in a way he appreciated. "Your documentation held up," she told him during the second call. "The cross-referencing you did between the log entries and the technician rosters, that gave us a very precise starting point. It would have taken significantly longer to get to the scope of this without it." "I just wrote down what I saw," he said. "Mr. Brooks," she said, with a dryness that was probably as close as she got to humor on a work call, "most people write down what they see. Very few people write it down the way you did." What Ethan was dealing with practically during this period was the ordinary difficulty of being unemployed at an inconvenient time. He had savings, not excessive savings, but the savings of a careful person who had grown up without much and had internalized the habit of not spending money that wasn't already replaced. And those savings provided a cushion that meant the immediate pressure was manageable. What was less manageable was the psychological texture of the days. He was a person who organized himself around work. He had structured his life around the rhythms of scheduled inspections and the specific satisfaction of a job done properly, and without that structure the days had a formlessness he found more draining than he'd expected. He took on a short-term consulting engagement through a contact he'd made years earlier, a smaller regional charter operation that needed an independent review of their maintenance documentation practices, which turned out to be, in the current climate, a more sought-after service than it might have been 6 months earlier. The work was straightforward and well within his capabilities, and it gave the days a shape. He also started running again, which he hadn't done consistently in several years. Every morning, before it was fully light, he ran a circuit through his neighborhood and the park beyond it, and during those 40 minutes he thought about nothing in particular, which was its own form of discipline. Marcus came over for dinner one evening in late January, and they ate takeout at Ethan's kitchen counter because he still hadn't bought a table, and Marcus said at one point, "You doing all right? Like, actually?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "You sure?" "Because I feel like something like this. It takes a toll even when you did the right thing. Maybe especially when you did the right thing." Ethan thought about it honestly. "There are days," he said. "Some days it feels, I don't know, heavy in a way I didn't anticipate. Not regret, just the weight of it." Marcus nodded. "That's real." "But then I think about 14 people on that Gulf Stream," Ethan said, "and the weight feels like the right kind of weight to carry." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "You're a weird guy, Ethan." "I know. I mean that as a compliment. I know that too." The formal charge documentation against Ryan Mercer was filed in federal court on the 14th of February, a date Ethan noted with no particular sense of irony, covering 4 counts related to the falsification of federal aviation maintenance records, 1 count related to obstruction following the evidence tampering attempt on the day of the inspection, and 2 additional counts that Draper explained to him were related to the manner in which certain operational costs had been recorded to obscure the nature of the directives being paid for. Mercer was released on bond. His attorney issued a statement indicating that he intended to contest all charges vigorously. Ethan read the statement on his phone while standing in the parking lot of the charter operation where he was doing his consulting work. He stood there for a moment with the cold February air on his face, reading the careful legal language of a man who had spent years being careful about exactly this kind of thing, and then he put his phone in his pocket and went back inside. The civil case, his wage claim, and the retaliation framework that Draper had constructed around it was filed the same week. The defendant was Sky Vista Aviation. Victoria Hale was named in her capacity as the company's chief executive. Draper had walked him through the filing the day before it went in, sitting across the desk with the papers between them. "This is going to get her attention," he said. "Given everything that's happening with the company right now, I anticipate they'll want to resolve this rather than litigate it. But I want you prepared for the possibility that it goes longer." "Whatever it takes," Ethan said. Draper looked at him. "You want more than the wages." "I want everything the contract entitles me to, and I want it on record that the termination was retaliatory. That's what the filing says." "Then the filing is right." Draper nodded slowly. "There's one other thing," he said. "I'm hearing, through channels, that Ms. Hale may be considering a direct approach, not through the legal process, a direct conversation. She apparently asked Carlisle to reach out." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "What does that mean practically?" "It means she may want to talk to you before this gets further along. It's unusual, but not unheard of, especially in situations where the person involved has some genuine accountability instinct underneath the legal strategy." Draper paused. "How do you feel about that?" Ethan looked at the papers on the desk between them. 9 months of work, $41,000 in torn halves on a concrete floor, a notebook full of dates and tail numbers, and a Gulf Stream that had been 4 hours from carrying 14 people into the sky on a maintenance record someone had signed in a dead man's name. "I'll talk to her," he said. The meeting with Victoria Hale happened on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of February, at a coffee shop neither of them had any association with, Neutral Ground, which had been Draper's suggestion and which Carlisle had agreed to without argument. The place was a small independent operation near the waterfront, the kind that had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu and didn't play music loud enough to intrude on conversation. Ethan arrived 7 minutes early and ordered a black coffee and sat at a corner table facing the door. He watched her come in. She looked different than she had in the hangar. Not diminished exactly. Victoria Hale didn't strike him as the kind of person who diminished easily, but the particular quality of forward momentum that had always characterized her physical presence was quieter now. She was dressed simply, no blazer, a dark sweater and coat, her hair down rather than pulled back. She ordered something at the counter and then came to his table and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "Thank you for agreeing to this," she said. "You asked," he said. "I didn't see a reason not to." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I want to start by saying something that isn't connected to the legal situation. Carlisle knows I'm doing this, and he's not happy about it, so I'd like to get it out before the practical part of the conversation." He waited. "I treated you badly," she said. "Not just at the end. The whole situation. The way the contract was structured. The way I let you operate without any real standing to raise concerns through formal channels. The way I dismissed what you were telling me when you tried to." She paused. "And then what I did in the hangar, tearing up your invoice in front of everyone. It was meant to be a statement, and it was the wrong statement, and I've thought about it more than I expected to." Ethan looked at her. He'd had a version of this conversation in his head, had run it through several times over the preceding weeks, and in most of those versions he'd felt some form of the anger that he'd been carrying quietly since December. Sitting here now, he found the anger was mostly just tired. "Why did you do it that way?" he asked. "The public part. Why in the hangar?" She held his gaze. "Because I thought it would make you go away quietly," she said. "I thought humiliation in front of your colleagues would make you accept less than you were owed and not push back. I'd done it before. Not exactly that, but versions of it. It had worked before." She stopped. "I didn't know what you were carrying. I didn't know you'd been watching for 11 weeks. I thought you were a contractor with inflated hours and too many questions, and I handled it the way I handled people I'd decided were problems. And now? Now I know you were the only person in that building who was doing their job the way it was supposed to be done," she said, plainly, without the cushioning that would have made it easier to say. "Including me." The coffee shop had filled up slightly around them. A couple with a stroller near the window, a man working on a laptop 2 tables over, the ordinary Tuesday morning texture of people going about their lives. Ethan looked at the surface of his coffee for a moment and then back at her. "What do you want from this conversation?" he asked. "I want to pay you what you're owed," she said. "The full invoice amount plus the additional period you're entitled to under the contract terms for wrongful termination. Draper can calculate the exact figure with Carlisle. I'm not going to contest it. Draper said you'd probably settle." "I'm not settling," she said, and there was a precision in it. "Settling implies I'm doing it to minimize damage. I'm paying you because you earned it, and I took it from you, and that's wrong. The distinction matters to me even if it doesn't matter legally." Ethan studied her. He was a person who paid attention to the gap between what people said and what their faces were doing while they said it, and in 11 months of working for Victoria Hale, he'd developed a specific literacy for her particular tells. Right now there was no gap. She was tired, and she meant what she was saying, and the fact that it happened to also be legally expedient didn't make it less true. "There's something else," he said, "not in the legal filing, something I want to say directly." "Go ahead." "The people who worked in that hangar, Okonkwo, Frazier, the overnight crew, most of them, they weren't bad people. They were people inside a system that made doing the right thing feel like professional suicide. That's on the system, not just on Ryan. And the system was yours." She didn't flinch. "I know. Whatever Sky Vista becomes going forward, if it becomes anything, that has to be the thing that changes first, not the paperwork, not the procedures. The actual understanding that a technician who grounds an aircraft is doing exactly what they're paid to do, and that doing it should never cost them anything. That's what I've been working on," she said. "I don't expect you to take my word for it." "I don't need to," he said. "The investigation will require it structurally, but structure doesn't fix culture. Structure is just the frame. The inside is still up to you." She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said again, and this time it carried more weight. The weight of someone who had been sitting with the full dimensions of a thing and had stopped trying to find the angle that made it smaller. They talked for another 30 minutes about practical matters: the payment timeline, the coordination between Draper and Carlyle, a few remaining documentation questions that the federal investigation had generated. It was businesslike and not unpleasant, two people who had been on opposite sides of something finding the specific register of conversation that the aftermath required. Before they left, Victoria said one more thing. "I offered Ryan every opportunity to tell me what was actually happening," she said. "He managed me very skillfully for a long time. I'm not saying that to shift responsibility. I'm saying it because I want you to know that I understand it doesn't excuse what I chose not to look at." She picked up her coat. "You looked. That's the difference." Ethan walked back to his car through the cold February air, thinking about what she'd said and about the specific nature of choice. The difference between not knowing and choosing not to know, which is a real difference but a narrower one than people generally find comfortable to examine. Ryan Mercer entered a guilty plea on 3 of the 6 charges in late March, following negotiations that Draper described to Ethan as unsurprising. The text message evidence had been the decisive factor, not just in the legal case but in Mercer's own calculation of what a jury would do with them, which was the kind of calculation Mercer had always been good at, and which had, in this particular instance, produced the accurate result. He received a sentence of 38 months with eligibility for reduced time under compliance conditions, along with a permanent bar from holding any position of supervisory authority over federally regulated aviation operations. His attorney issued a statement that characterized the plea as a practical decision made in the interests of all parties. Mercer himself said nothing publicly. Ethan, when Draper called him with the news, was standing at a workbench in the charter operations maintenance bay, holding a calibration tool he'd been about to use. And he stood there for a moment after the call ended, and then set the tool down carefully and went and got a cup of water from the cooler in the corner and drank it. That was all. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt the way you feel when a long-pending thing finally resolves. Not relief exactly, but the quiet cessation of a low-grade tension you'd gotten so used to carrying that you'd stopped noticing its weight until the moment it was gone. Okonkwo kept his license. The FAA's review of the technicians who had been directed by Mercer to falsify records resulted in a range of outcomes that distinguished between those who had acted under explicit managerial coercion and those who had participated more voluntarily. Okonkwo fell clearly in the former category, and his cooperation and the quality of his testimony had been documented explicitly in Hargrove's final report. He received a formal reprimand and a mandatory retraining requirement and was permitted to continue working as a certifying technician. He called Ethan in April. The call lasted about 12 minutes, and neither of them talked around what it was about. "I should have done what you did," Okonkwo said. "Maybe," Ethan said. "Or you should have been in a place where doing it didn't feel like losing everything." "That's generous." "It's accurate. Both things can be true." There was a pause. "I signed off on that phenom," Okonkwo said. "I signed off on it, and every time I think about it, He stopped. "Nothing happened," Ethan said. "That's luck, not judgment." "Yeah," Ethan said. "I know, but you've got a kid now, right?" 7 months. "Then you know what you do with luck when you get it." Another pause, longer this time. "How are you doing?" Okonkwo asked. "Working," Ethan said, "which is all I ever really wanted." Skyvista's restructuring took the better part of 6 months. 2 of the 3 major investors who'd pulled back in December re-engaged on revised terms that included an independent safety oversight board, a condition that the FAA's remediation requirements had effectively mandated anyway. The company retained 4 aircraft from its original fleet, the 2 that had cleared inspection, and 2 others that had been brought fully up to standard through remedial maintenance that was this time performed, documented, and verified by an independent third-party auditor. Victoria Hale remained as CEO, a decision that had surprised some observers and hadn't surprised others. She'd survived the board review, narrowly, and on the specific basis of her handling of the crisis once it broke, which had been characterized by a level of direct accountability that board members who'd been through other corporate crises recognized as unusual. She'd been required to accept a co-executive arrangement with an independent operations director for a period of not less than 18 months, and she'd accepted it without the political maneuvering that might have been expected. She also, and this was not covered by any legal requirement, retained a safety culture consultant for 3 months to work directly with the maintenance staff. The consultant's mandate was narrow, not to redesign procedures, which the remediation requirements handled, but to understand why the people on the floor had felt unable to speak up, and to identify the specific organizational dynamics that had made silence feel safer than honesty. The consultant produced a report. Victoria read it in full and gave it to every manager who remained in the company. The restructured Sky Vista resumed limited operations in May, under the oversight conditions the FAA had established. The resumption was quiet. No press event. No announcement that leaned on the language of renewal and second chances that corporate communications departments tend to reach for. A few flights, properly maintained aircraft, properly documented inspections. The ordinary, unglamorous work of a company trying to become what it should have been. Ethan received his payment, full invoice plus the additional entitlement Draper had calculated, in a wire transfer on the last Friday of March. He was at his desk when the bank notification came through, and he looked at the number on his screen and then closed his laptop and sat quietly for a minute. $41,460. 9 months of 6-day weeks and sore hands and a notebook full of things he'd written down because he couldn't not write them down. It was the right number. It was just money, which was simultaneously nothing and not nothing at all, depending on the week and the rent and how close you were to the margin between fine and not fine. He called his mother that evening. She was 71 and lived in the town where he'd grown up, within earshot of the regional airport, and she'd known something was going on since December because she could read his voice on the phone the way she'd been able to read his face as a kid. He told her the broad shape of it. She listened without interrupting, which was where he'd gotten that particular skill. "Are you all right?" she asked when he was done. "Yeah," he said. "I'm all right." "You did the right thing," she said. "I know. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I want you to hear it out loud from someone who's known you your whole life. You did the right thing and it cost you something, and that's real, and I'm proud of you." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Thanks, Mom. Are you eating properly?" "I'm eating fine." "You always say that." "Because it's always true." She made a sound that communicated skepticism across 300 miles, and he smiled at his kitchen wall, and they talked for another 20 minutes about nothing consequential, which was its own kind of necessary. In late May, Victoria called him directly, not through Carlisle, not through Draper, directly, on his cell, which she had from the days when operational questions would come to him after hours. "I have a question," she said, "and I want you to know there's no obligation attached to it in any form." "Go ahead," he said. "I'm building a new safety oversight role, not operations director. That's filled. This is a different function, a direct reporting line to me and to the independent board, with authority to ground any aircraft pending investigation, full stop. No operational override. The job is to be the person who catches what I missed, with the actual standing to do something about it." She paused. "I thought of you." He'd thought about this possibility, obliquely, since the meeting in the coffee shop. He'd known it might come. "What does the role look like day to day?" he asked. She described it. It was a real job, well designed, with genuine authority built into its structure rather than implied. She'd thought it through, he could tell. "Can I ask you something honestly?" he said when she finished. "Please." "Is this because you think I'm the right person for this job? Or because you think offering it to me is the right thing to do after everything that happened?" There was a pause. "Both," she said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I've thought hard about whether someone who saw what was wrong inside this company is more or less qualified to prevent it from happening again, and I keep arriving at the same answer." He was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, the city was moving through a warm May morning, and he could hear, faintly, the sound of a distant aircraft on an approach path. The same sound he'd grown up with, low and metallic and permanent. "I'm going to decline," he said. A brief pause. "Can I ask why?" Because the job I'm good at is the one I've always done, he said. Getting close to an aircraft and knowing whether it's safe. The work that happens in the bay, not in the office. I think if I take a leadership position inside this company, I become something different than what I actually am. And I'm not sure that serves either of us well. He thought for a moment. And because the oversight role you're describing needs to be someone with standing inside the organization. Someone who's grown up in SkyVista's specific culture and knows where the pressure points are. I'd be coming in as the guy who blew the whole thing up. That carries a different kind of authority, and not necessarily the useful kind. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That's a more thoughtful answer than I expected, she said, not unkindly. I've had some time to think, he said. Is there anything I can offer you that you'd actually accept? He'd thought about this too. One thing, he said. Not for me. For every technician in your maintenance operation, current and future. A written policy posted physically in the hangar that states explicitly that any employee who grounds an aircraft for safety reasons is protected from any form of retaliation, including informal retaliation, altered schedules, reduced hours, being made to feel like a problem, and a direct reporting channel for concerns that bypasses operations management entirely. That's already in the remediation requirements. I know it is. I want you to do it anyway, not because the FAA requires it, but because you mean it. The difference shows. There was a pause on the line that felt like someone making a decision rather than waiting to speak. All right, she said, I'll do it that way. He went back to work the following week. A new contract with a regional operator 3 hours north. Straightforward inspection work on a mixed fleet. The kind of job that didn't carry any of the weight of what the previous 9 months had been. He drove up on a Sunday evening and checked into a motel near the airport and lay on the bed looking at the ceiling with the familiar low sound of aircraft movements in the background and felt, for the first time in several months, something that wasn't complicated. The work started Monday morning at 6. He was in the bay by 5:50 because he'd always been early, because being early was part of how he did what he did. He pulled on his jacket, picked up his flashlight and his clipboard, and began the first inspection with the same methodology he'd been using for 11 years. Systematic, thorough, the kind of careful attention that assumed nothing and verified everything. There's a thing that people misunderstand about quiet people who do honest work without seeking recognition for it. The misunderstanding is that they're modest or selfless or somehow indifferent to their own interests. Usually, that's not it. Usually what's happening is something simpler. They found the version of themselves that works, and they know it, and they don't need anyone else to confirm it to make it real. Ethan Brooks was not a humble man in the way the word is often meant, not self-effacing, not uncertain about his own competence. He was a man who had spent 11 years learning to be very good at a specific thing that mattered, and who had understood somewhere along the way that the value of that thing didn't require an audience. The aircraft either was safe or it wasn't. The log either was accurate or it wasn't. These were facts, not opinions, and facts didn't change based on whether the right people were watching. What he'd done at SkyVista, the notebook, the photographs, the phone call at 7:45 in the morning, had not been an act of courage in the dramatic sense. He hadn't felt brave. He'd felt the way he felt every time he identified a discrepancy on an aircraft, clear and certain, and aware that the next step was the only step available to someone who understood what the discrepancy meant. The courage, if that's what it was, had been in the 11 weeks before the phone call, in showing up every day to work inside a system he knew was wrong, doing his own work properly inside it, accumulating the record that made the phone call possible. That part was unglamorous and slow, and there were days when it felt pointless, when the facility hummed with its ordinary business and the aircraft departed on schedule, and the world outside continued turning without any indication that the thing he was watching was as serious as he believed it to be. But he'd kept going, not because he was certain the record would ever matter, because he was the kind of person who wrote things down. Victoria Hale rebuilt her company slowly, the way things that are built to last usually get built, without fanfare, with a lot of hard and uninteresting work, with the specific humility of someone who has had the full dimensions of their own mistakes made undeniable. She was not a reformed person in the neat sense that stories sometimes require. She was a complicated person who had done real damage and was doing the real imperfect work of making something better from what remained. Some days she got it right. Some days the old pressure returned and she caught herself about to make the old kind of decision, and she stopped and made a different one. That was the actual process, unbeautiful and ongoing, and she'd stopped expecting it to feel like resolution. Okonkwo went back to work. He was a good technician. He'd always been a good technician, which was the thing that made what he'd done under Mercer's pressure so costly to him personally, because good technicians understood exactly what they were signing when they signed something wrong. He carried that knowledge the way adults carry most of the significant mistakes of their lives, not lightly, but without being consumed by it. His daughter was born in late April, small and loud and entirely uninterested in the moral complexities of the adult world she'd arrived in. He held her in the hospital and thought about the Phenom 300 for the last time, really the last time, in the way that some thoughts finally exhaust themselves, and decided that the best thing he could do with the experience was to never, under any circumstances, let it happen again. The summer came. Ethan worked. He drove long stretches of highway between contracts, which he didn't mind because he liked driving, liked the specific freedom of an open road and a known destination. He called his mother on Sundays. He ran in the mornings. He kept his notebook. On an early morning in August, he was standing in a maintenance bay at the regional operator's facility. A newer installation, clean and well organized, the kind of place where the culture of taking care was evident in the small details, the labeled tool racks and the properly calibrated equipment, and the handoff protocols that meant each shift knew exactly what the previous one had done. And he was doing a pre-dawn inspection on a turboprop that was scheduled for a first departure at 7. He moved through the aircraft methodically, the way he always did. Control surfaces, engine access panels, structural inspection points. He had his flashlight and his clipboard and the specific internal checklist he'd been running in his head since the first aircraft he'd ever inspected, which was nothing more than accumulated knowledge made into habit. Outside, through the bay's open doors, the sky was beginning to shift from black to the particular deep blue that comes just before the first true light. The aircraft on the ramp were silhouettes. Somewhere across the airfield, a ground vehicle moved with its amber warning light rotating, and the sound of its engine carried in the pre-dawn quiet with unusual clarity. He found nothing wrong with the turboprop. It was what the logbook said it was, which was what it was supposed to be. He made his notes, signed the inspection report with his initials and the time, and set the clipboard on the work table. The first pilot arrived at 6:15, a woman in her early 40s who'd been flying for the operator for 3 years and had a manner that was relaxed without being casual, the manner of someone who was comfortable with what she did and took it seriously precisely because she was comfortable with it. She nodded at Ethan, picked up the inspection report, and read through it with genuine attention rather than the performative glance that some pilots gave paperwork they'd already decided to trust. "Looks clean," she said. "It is," he said. She looked up briefly, a small nod, and went to begin her own walk-around. He watched her move around the aircraft with a flashlight and a practiced eye, and he thought about what it meant, the whole chain of it. The inspection he'd just completed, the report she was reading, the maintenance culture that had produced both. The invisible agreement between everyone in this industry that the work would be done honestly, because the alternative was something none of them were willing to be responsible for. It wasn't a glamorous system. It was made of checklists and calibration schedules and the tedious specificity of people like him spending pre-dawn hours in cold bays looking at things most people never thought about. It worked, when it worked, because enough individuals inside it decided every day to do the thing correctly even when no one was watching, even when doing it incorrectly would be faster or easier or less professionally inconvenient. And when it didn't work, when someone like Ryan Mercer decided the calculus ran the other way, when a culture like Sky Vista's quietly rewarded the wrong things long enough that the wrong things became normal, then it needed someone like Ethan, not heroic, not exceptional in any quality except the specific one of paying attention and writing it down and being unwilling to pretend that what he saw wasn't what he saw. He was not under any illusion that this made him remarkable. He was under no illusion at all, which was, in the end, the thing that had made him useful. The turboprop taxied out at 7:10. He watched it from the edge of the ramp as it moved toward the runway in the early morning light, and he watched it rotate and climb, and he tracked it until it was small and then smaller and then gone into the blue above the tree line, carrying its passengers toward wherever they were going. He went inside and poured himself a coffee and looked at the day's inspection schedule and picked up his clipboard. He had work to do.